was simply savvy strategy, and Ida was a savvy woman.
Imagine being born into slavery, witnessing the brutality of man, and deciding to take on a nation armed with only the power of your pen. Join us as we discover the courageous life of Ida B. Wells.
Ida B. Wells, a woman who did not receive that type of recognition in her life and never would have. I cried like a baby.
A woman whose strength and conviction transformed the fight for justice in America. Today, we're diving into her incredible journey, her fight for truth, and her enduring legacy. Make sure to hit those like, share, subscribe, and join buttons. Her story starts in the throes of the Civil War on a plantation in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Ida B. Wells was born on July 16, 1862. Both of her parents, James and Lizzie Wells, were slaves. The war ended, and the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863. The Wells family, along with millions of other slaves, were granted their freedom. But like many other slaves, freedom was a complicated concept. After decades of forced labor, former slaves were conflicted about using the skills they were forced to develop, but many decided to cast down their buckets where they were. Ida's father, James Wells, was a skilled carpenter and a staunch advocate for education. Despite the barriers of racism and the laws that prohibited Black people from receiving formal education, James ensured his children attended school. While her father focused on mind, her mother focused on the spirit of her children. Lizzie Wells instilled a deep sense of Christian faith and resilience in her children. Through teaching them the Bible and frequenting the church, she made sure her kids believed that their steps were ordained. This combination of education and spirituality would shape Ida's outlook on life. An overlooked aspect of the African American experience is that along with the brutality of slavery, the racism of the antebellum South, Jim Crow, and any of the harsh and unfair obstacles, Black people still had to deal with everyday struggles like every other human, no matter the race. So in 1878, a yellow fever epidemic swept through the Mississippi Valley, and it didn't discriminate. Down in the Delta, the yellow fever infected 120,000 people and took the lives of 20,000, including James and Lizzie Wells. Both of her parents and the younger sibling died as a result of the yellow fever. Left to care for her remaining siblings, Ida took on the responsibility of teaching to support her family. This role not only showcased her resourcefulness, but also ignited her passion for education and advocacy. Miss Wells lost her parents, but she didn't lose her focus, especially on education. At just 16 years old, Ida became the primary caregiver for her and her remaining siblings, forcing her to take on a career as a teacher. Prior to becoming a teacher, Ida was enrolled at Shaw University. At the time, Shaw University provided newly free slaves with basic literacy. Shaw University, now known as Rust College, is one of the oldest historical Black colleges in the nation. After the death of her parents, Ida and her remaining siblings moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where Ida worked as a teacher. While in Memphis, Ida got to see Jim Crow laws on full display. Her experiences in the classroom made her acutely aware of the systemic inequalities in education for African Americans, fueling her commitment to social justice. To further her potency as an educator, Ida B. Wells enrolled into another historically Black college, Fisk University. Located in Nashville, Tennessee, Fisk University was one of the few institutions in America that offered rigorous academics and leadership development for African Americans during Reconstruction. Ms. Wells went on to receive advanced teacher training not only from Fisk, but also took coursework at Lemoyne-Owen College, another HBCU. It's safe to say she took education just as seriously as her father. Enjoying this content? Want to support more Black history like this? Well, consider clicking the join button and becoming an exclusive member of our team. The quote, "The pen is mightier than the sword," was first written by novelist and playwright Edward Bulwer Lytton in 1839 in his play Cardinal Richelieu. The play is about a priest that plots to assassinate the king, but as a priest, he is unable to take up arms against his enemies. So how do you take down a mighty power without an army? That is the question Ida B. Wells faced after an incident in 1884. Miss Wells had purchased a first-class ticket on a train traveling from Memphis, Tennessee to Woodstock, Tennessee. She had paid the extra money in order to enjoy the comforts not available to the segregated section of the train. However, at some point, first class became overcrowded, and Miss Wells was ordered to give up her seat to a white woman. Despite holding the proper ticket, she was ordered to move to the segregated smoking car, which was dirty and uncomfortable. She refused, asserting her right to the seat she had paid for. In response, train officials physically dragged her off the train. It was one woman versus the might of Jim Crow. a black woman unable to take up arms against her enemy, racism. The humiliating and unjust experience fueled Wells' determination to fight racial discrimination. Ida B. Wells filed a lawsuit against the Chesapeake, Ohio, and Southwestern Railroad Company. She won, initially, receiving a $500 settlement. However, the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned the ruling, and Wells was ordered to pay court costs. However, this particular incident sparked her lifelong commitment to activism and justice. It inspired her to begin writing about social injustices, leading to her career as a journalist and editor, and ultimately cemented her role as a prominent voice in the fight against systemic racism and inequality. Ida B. Wells transitioned into journalism, using the power of her pen to combat the injustices of harassment and injustices surrounding race relations in America. She began as a writer for the Memphis Free Speech under the moniker Lola. While at the Memphis Free Speech, Ms. Wells did investigative reporting on lynchings, detailing the true motives and exposing the cover-ups behind such violence. Her work there gained her and the paper national attention. She continued to showcase her pen power through groundbreaking pamphlets, including Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, and The Red Record. By 1892, Ms. Wells not only wrote for the Memphis Free Speech, but she was also part owner of the publication. Her writings had garnered her attention from all over the country and earned her the ire of racist white folk. The paper became a powerful platform of her outspoken criticism of racism, injustice, and particularly the widespread practice of lynching. In response, the printing press was destroyed. This stemmed from her editorial condemning the lynching of 3 African-American men who were co-owners of a successful grocery store. The store, coincidentally, was in direct competition with the white-owned business. However, the men were accused of plotting war against white men. Thomas Moss owned the People's Grocery Store and was found dead alongside 2 store workers, Calvin McDowell and Henry Stewart. Moss was a dear friend of Miss Wells. She took on avenging his death with her pen. She challenged the narrative between their death. Miss Wells believed that lynching was a tactic to enforce racial and economic oppression. At the time, many black Americans began to free themselves of debt and began to make upward economic and social movement. And in response, they were met with violence. In her writing, she boldly urged African Americans to leave Memphis and boycott white business in protest. In response, a white mob attacked the Free Speech office, destroying its printing press. This incident forced Ida B. Wells to flee Memphis and move to New York City. She would never return to Memphis, but she continued to wield her weapon of choice. After the destruction of her paper, Ms. Wells released Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. Here, she challenged the oft-used justification that black men were lynched to protect white women from assault. Through her research, Ms. Wells uncovered that most, if not all of those accusations, were either fabricated or retaliation against a discovered consensual relationship between a black man and a white woman. She continued to lay out evidence that these acts of brutality were used as a tool to seize economic and social control. Ms. Wells documented cases where black business owners were competing against white business owners, but then they were suddenly accused of a heinous crime. She concluded by urging the black communities to protest these lynchings, boycott white-owned businesses, and advocated for black communities to arm themselves against these violent attacks. In 1895, she continued to build on her research when she released The Red Record. The Red Record expanded Wells' investigation into the patterns and statistics of lynching in the United States. This pamphlet provided a detailed analysis of the causes and scope of racial violence. Here, Ms. Wells went through documented cases from 1892 to 1894, categorizing them by alleged causes and noting the total numbers of victims. She used these numbers to demonstrate that most lynchings had no basis in criminal activity. She instead debunked the oft-used justifications for these heinous crimes and exposed the hypocrisy of the U.S. legal system. Through these writings and others, Ms. Wells was able to demonstrate how lynching operated outside the rule of law and violated democratic principles. Her writings popularized her, bringing nationwide attention to the lynchings of black Americans. By the turn of the century, a few prominent black leaders began to spark movements of change on a national scale. In 1909, Ms. Wells became one of the co-founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Alongside civil rights advocates like W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, and Archibald Grimke, as well as several white co-founders, the NAACP was created to achieve racial equality and combat racial injustices. However, her relationship with the organization was, well, complex. Ms. Wells was often sidelined from NAACP events because some within the organization considered her tactics somewhat too radical. The NAACP believed in integration, institutional reform, and effecting legislative change. However, Ms. Wells believed more in grassroots movement. The tension was so great that Ida B. Wells was initially not credited as a co-founder. This, she believed, was a reflection of how women, especially black women, were viewed at the time. The battle for black women's rights would be her next crusade. In 1913, Ms. Wells co-founded the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, Illinois. The club aimed to educate black women on voting rights, encourage voter registration, and amplify the voices with the black community. The Alpha Suffrage Club ensured that black women were included in political decision-making and countered any efforts to marginalize the power black women had within the struggle for women's rights. Ms. Wells led the charge to confront racism within other women's suffrage organizations. Many white suffragists prioritized gaining the vote for white women, often proving hostile or indifferent to the struggles of black women. She would challenge anyone who she felt stood in the way of progress. Ms. Wells once clashed with the leaders of the National American Women's Suffrage Association because she believed they excluded black women to appease Southern white suffragists. This spirit of defiance was on full display at a suffrage parade in 1913. Still here? Make sure you share this video with 5 other people who love black history. The First Amendment of the Constitution protects the right to protest under the freedom to express yourself, the freedom to assemble, and the right to ask the government for a redress of grievances. So during the 1913 women's suffrage procession in Washington, D.C., all women were allowed to voice their grievances, but black women, even in protesting, had to march from the back of the parade. However, Ms. Wells could not accept the hypocrisy of America. She instead joined the white women, walking alongside them, refusing to take second-class status, and highlighted her insistence on equality for all women. Ms. Wells continued advocating for the rights of black women, pointing to issues like economic inequality, limited educational opportunities, and other issues grossly ignored by mainstream feminist movements. The work of Ms. Wells puts her at the front of intersectionality before that was even a thing. Her intersection was race and gender, and at the center laid Black American. Ida B. Wells holds a pivotal place in black history because she refused to accept the status quo of injustice. At a time when racial violence was rampant and women's voices were often silenced, Ida emerged as a fearless journalist, activist, and suffragist. Ida B. Wells married Ferdinand L. Barnett in 1895, and together they had 4 children. Because of the support of her husband, who was also a civil rights advocate, she was able to continue her work despite being criticized for not being a stay-at-home mother. Ida B. Wells continued to fight fiercely until her death on March 25, 1931. Her work as a top-notch investigative journalist and a crusader for anti-lynching earned her a posthumous Pulitzer Prize in 2020. Ida B. Wells Barnett was more than just a journalist. She was a truth-teller, a justice seeker, and a voice for the voiceless. Her life's work serves as a powerful reminder of the impact one person can have in the face of overwhelming odds. As we reflect on her legacy, we're reminded of the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter the cost. What other trailblazers in black history should we cover next? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire change.